Welcome again, everyone, to this partner event between the Institute of Jewish Studies and the British Friends of the Hebrew University, a moment to step out of dreadful circumstances which many of us find ourselves in. I'm Nigel, I head the British Friends of the Hebrew University. And this year, I understand the Institute of Jewish Studies is marking its 70th anniversary, whereas the Hebrew University, which opened in 1925, will mark its centenary year as a centre of academic and research excellence, both in Israel and internationally. I offer a special thank you on behalf of everyone to Sarah Ben Isaac for this partnership and to my colleagues Alison and Maria for their hard work worrying through all the details. Some brief housekeeping, if I may. We recommend you watch in speaker view. Please keep your microphones muted throughout. At any time, feel free to post your brief questions into the chat box, which Alison will manage later. Both organisations would love you to remain in touch. If you have not already opted in, please do so using the links that will appear in the chat box in order to keep abreast of our news and events from each organisation. These links will also be advised later after the event, and I should add that the event is being recorded. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Professor Edwin Seroussi is the Emanuel Alexandre Professor Emeritus of Musicology and Chair of the Academic Committee of the Jewish Music Research Center, both at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a visiting scholar at Dartmouth College, and in 2023-24, fellow at the Herbert G. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Edwin made Aliyah from Montevideo, Uruguay, which I've had the pleasure of visiting, in 1971, where he took undergraduate and graduate degrees in musicology at the Hebrew University, later continuing to his PhD from UCLA in 1987. He taught at Bar Ilan and Tel Aviv universities and was professor at universities in Europe, North and South America. His research focuses on Jewish musical cultures of the Mediterranean and Middle East and their interactions with Islamic cultures, with Judeo-Spanish song and music in Israel. He explores a variety of development processes in diverse contexts and historical periods, including the Ottoman Empire, colonial Morocco and Algeria, Germany's Second Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in addition to Zionist settlement in Palestine and the Judeo-Spanish-speaking diaspora. Professor Seroussi, we're thrilled to have you with us, and we look forward to learning about a spark of King David, Rabbi Israel Najara's musical poetry. Thank you. Bavakasha.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for this kind introduction. Thank you to the British Friends of Hebrew University for their continued support for Jewish music research at Hebrew University. Thank you to the University of London also for hosting me. And I am glad, after scrolling over the names of those attending, to see some of my best friends in Great Britain, colleagues. Thank you all for coming. The presentation is all based on a PowerPoint, so if you allow me just 1 second, we will share the screen with you. Okay, so those of you who know me know that I always start a lecture on music with music. So let's hear a few sounds before I introduce the subject.
מפה
There is no better way to start a presentation about Sephardic culture than to do that with a very beautiful Hasidic nigun from Eastern Europe. The connections will become clear as we advance in our lecture. Who are you, Rabbi Israel Najara? Well, he's very well known as a poet. However, Rabbi Israel was also a rabbinical scholar, a biblical commentator, a scribe, a pedagogue, and a composer and performer, if you want, a singer-songwriter in modern terms. And perhaps he was also a good graver, a visual artist too. The rabbi was born most probably in the city of Safed around the year 1550. A Shion from a family of Jews from Spain. His grandfather, Rabbi Levi, was one of those Jews expelled from Spain who settled in the Ottoman Empire. His father, Rabbi Moshe, was a very important scholar and Kabbalist. And Rabbi Israel spent most of his adult life in the city of Damascus in Syria, where he worked for the Jewish community, mostly a scribe of the Jewish community, but also a spiritual leader. And the last 10 years of his life, he was the rabbi in Gaza, in the Jewish community of the city of Gaza. This is why Rabbi Israel is also a little bit more in the news this day. The presence of Rabbi Israel Najara in Jewish culture, in world culture even, is sometimes missed simply because people don't know who wrote the songs. But here we have one example of a song dedicated to the leaders of the United Nations in the 1940s by Rabbi Israel Abrahams, and the text is related to the song with I opened this presentation, an ancient Jewish prayer by Israel Najara of Palestine, written in the 16th century. Well, I will go into more details regarding, with more precision, what Rabbi Israel Abrahams means by that. Let me go straight into the most important output of Rabbi Israel Najara's work, which is his poetry. And here you have the first edition of his songs, Zemirot Israel, printed in Safed, in Tzfat, in 1587. Now, you may take this for granted, a Jewish book published towards the end of the 16th century, about 100 years after Jewish books started to be published. However, this book was the second book published in the new Hebrew press in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. There was no printing press in Israel until that year. That printing press didn't last for very long. It published only 3 books. And you will think, okay, what books will be published that are important to the Jewish constituency? The Tanakh, the Bible, the Talmud, Midrashim, Halacha. Why a book of poetry? Well, it says something about the fame that already as a young poet, Rabbi Israel Najara had in the Middle East. And this flagship publication of his was extremely unique for several reasons, as I will show. But first, let's read something from the introduction that the rabbi wrote for his book of poetry. He needed to justify something that he's doing in this work. As you will see, most of the poetry here is set to music that belongs to non-Jewish cultures. And so writes the rabbi. They, that is to say, the Jews of his community in Safed or in Damascus, are attracted to pleasant melodies, and among them melodies that were composed by the Gentile master of melodies, who is not a son of our people. And they are unable to adapt them to the poems of our sacred language because they differ in the number of syllables. So here we have a practice of singing and music making that was by then very well entrenched in Jewish culture and in Sephardi culture in particular. That is to say, to recycle existing melodies from different songs and use them for a new poem. So the issue was that the adaptation of those melodies to new poems in the sacred language, that is to say in Hebrew, and Aramaic, I should add, was not very efficient, if I should put it this way. The poets didn't have enough of a craft to set up the right words to the tunes. And this is what Rabbi Israel set himself to do. Here you have in front of you arguably Najara's most famous poem, Yah Ribbon Olam. This is a poem that every Jew today sings around the Sabbath table or in other smachot, in other joyous events. But very few people know who wrote the song. Not always is printed in the booklets where the song appears, who is the poet. The song became legendary. That's the song that I played for you at the beginning of this lecture. That's the song that Rabbi Israel Abrams composed, set up in English for the United Nations. And here you have the first editions of the song. On your right side, in a very scratchy and poor printing, you have the Safed edition of 1587. You can see how poor the press was. On the other side, you have the new edition of Rabbi Israel Najara's Emirot Israel, published in Venice at the turn of the 17th century, 1599 to 1600. And you see how beautiful the Venice edition is in terms of typography. Let me tell you that in the middle, Zemirot Israel was published also in Salonika in 1598-99. My friends, how many contemporary poets have their poetry published in 3 different editions within 13 years, in a time where the press was so rare? That means that the demand for the consumption of this new poetry is staggering. 13 years, 3 editions of Najara's poetry. But what is more important in Yah Ribbon Olam is that, as you can see, every poem has a title, and the title tells you to what melody it has to be sung. The names of the melodies are in Turkish, in Arabic, in Judeo-Spanish, and even in Greek. Remember, the Ottoman Empire came on the ashes of the Byzantine Empire, and Greek was still an important language at the time. And the rabbi also classifies the song. If you're not sure what language the name of the melody is, he wrote Aravi. That is to say, this is an Arabic melody in the case of Yah Ribbon. And Yah Ribbon is based originally on an Arabic song that reads more or less Yah Rabbi Salim Slimy, which may be translated as, "Oh my God, provide or make peace." Very important for our days. However, you see that there is another small detail here on the side, another word. The word says rust. It doesn't mean a lot to most of you, but if you are a musician expert on Middle Eastern music, whether Arabic or Turkish or Persian, this means a musical mode, a musical scale, which is one of the basic ones and one of the most important ones. So the rabbi provides musical information beyond the name of the melody. That is to say, the name of the musical scale. And moreover, the whole of Zemirot Israel is arranged according to the musical modes of Turkish Ottoman music of his time. This is a revolutionary mode that puts music at the center of the organization of new Hebrew poetry. Here you have the song again, and you can see the layout of the song. First of all, Rabbi Israel signed his songs with the acrostic of his name. You see here Israel in big red letters. The first letter of each strophe bears the name of the poet. Sometimes he signed Israel ben Moshe in the name of his father, and sometimes he signed very long poems, Israel ben Moshe ben Levi. He still remembers his grandfather expelled from Spain 100 years ago, before the publication of this book, of this poetry. He still remembers his grandfather in his poetry. You can see also that the version that the rabbi wrote is not the version that Jewish families sing today. In the second line, I just put one example, one of several. Ant u Malka Melech Malchaya, and this is what we sing today. But the rabbi wrote, Ant Malki Melech Malchaya. You are not a king, but you are my king. So this is part of the transmission of Hebrew poetry from generation to generation that introduces changes, not always for the better. Here you have another very important aspect of Rabbi Najara's poetry. Remember, as I told you, he was also a scholar, a biblical scholar, a commentator of several books in the Tanakh, in the Bible. And here you have just an example in a couple of stanzas from Yah Ribbon, the quotations he uses from the sacred texts. That is to say, the poetry, this modern Hebrew poetry, is totally immersed in the language of the Bible. Yah Ribbon Olam, Be'almaya, O Yah, O Master, forever and ever. It is taken, as you can see below, from the book of Daniel, which, of course, in a poem in Aramaic, you will have many quotations from Daniel that has substantial sections in Aramaic, and you can see forever, even forever and ever appears here. The same with the expression, it is beautiful to declaim them before you. You can see the quotation also from Daniel. And for example, Vezakef Kefifin, lift up the low, is taken from the book of Psalms. Obviously, the book of Psalms is one of the main repositories for Rabbi Israel Najara's poetry.
يا رب عالمي عالميا يا رب عالمي عالميا أنتم ملك 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 ملكيا عبدي بوتا خويتي معيا عبدي بديجي بوتك ويتمايا سيفا قدامي قدامي ليا حبايا يا رب العالم ذي علميا يا رب العالم ذي علميا أنتم ملك 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 ملخيا.
You heard a recording from our magnificent sound archives at the National Library of Israel, previously of the Hebrew University. This recording was done in the 1960s, that is to say, half a century ago. From my perspective as a scholar of Jewish music, a recording of this more than half a century ago, it's like a document of archaeological evidence. I cannot promise you that this is the melody that Rabbi Israel, the Arabic melody that Rabbi Israel had in mind, but aesthetically, I am sure that it's very close in its way of singing and form to what the rabbi had in mind a few hundred years ago. I talk about the structure of the poems, about the acrostic, about the different melodies, but what about the content of this poetry? Well, there are two main subjects that reign over most of the 1,005 poems of Rabbi Israel Najara that we know. First of all, there is the issue of rescuing the people of Israel. Remember, we are talking about a generation that has the expulsion from Spain very fresh in their minds. This was a catastrophe. This was a trauma for the Jewish people, and therefore the aspiration for being rescued by the Kadosh Baruch Hu, by God, that on a time of crisis, it was a main subject in Najara's poetry. And the other one is the subject of return. Also from the same poem, Yah Ribbon, return to your temple and to the Holy of Holies. That is to say, return to restore the national identity or the national integrity of the people of Israel after all these catastrophes. That is to say, my friends, in other words, that this poetry has a function of relief for people under trauma and to give them hope for better days to come in the future. As I already showed you, there is a growth in the poetical production of Najara throughout his life. The version of Zmirot Israel published in 1600 was not the end of the rabbi's poetical output. As we learned from Rabbi David Conforte, who engaged in a visit to Eretz Israel, he writes as follows in his book about called Korea Dorot, the story of the generations. And in the city of Gaza, there was the Torah teacher, the Rabbi Israel Najara, who composed the book Zemirot Israel. That's the book that I show you published 3 times, the last time in Venice, and also composed the book She'erit Israel, consisting of Ismonim, but it was not published. So there is much more poetry that was not published after the publication of Zemirot Israel. And here, to my dear British friends, you can be proud that the most important manuscript of Rabbi Israel Najara of his unpublished poetry, She'erit Israel, is found today at the Library of the University of Cambridge, manuscript ad 531.1. And it remained unpublished until this year, when I had the honor of publishing Rabbi Israel's poetry, 490 new poems written by him in the last 25 years of his life, We are launching this book in Jerusalem in a couple of weeks. So here you can have some British pride in the conservation of Rabbi Israel Najara's legacy. Arguably, the most famous poem in Sherit Israel is this poem, Ya'ala, Ya'ala, Boi Legani, which the fate of this poem is interesting, even though it is in an anthology that was printed. The people loved this poem so much that they continued to transmit it, and eventually they printed separately as an independent poem, and it continued to be sung to this very day. What is the lachan, the melody that the rabbi assigned to this song, Ya'ala, Ya'ala, Boi Legani? I will show you the translation very soon. The song is Ya'Allah, Ya'Allah, Insur al-Sultani. And for you who are in Britain, the translation is very simple. Oh, God, save the king. In this case, God save the Sultan. So on the basis of that, the rabbi wrote the poem. One of the books where this poem appears is just one example to show you the spread of Rabbi Israel Najara poetry. The Sefer Pizmonim, a book of Hebrew songs published in Bombay by the Iraqi Jewish immigrants who settled in India. Again, this is a British story, an imperial story, where Jews navigate within the British Empire, and they took with them their poetry, and they published that in India too. Here you have the translation of Ya'Allah, Ya'Allah, and you can see even by reading the very first lines, although my doe come into my garden, the pomegranate has blossomed, my vine is in bloom. Literal words from the Song of Songs. And if you read the whole poem, it's I would say, a virtuosic poetic deed that Rabbi Israel Najara did of, in a way, setting in verse the whole Song of Songs. Every line in this poem draws from the Song of Songs. Let's listen now to one melody which is very dear to me, very important. And this is a melody by a composer, Ezra Aaron Effendi, who was born in Baghdad in 1903 and died in Jerusalem. And this melody became very popular in Israel in the past 20 years. So you're going to hear Israeli rocker Barry Sakharov performing the melody written by an Iraqi Jew some 100 years ago to a poem by Rabbi Israel Najara written about 400 years ago. This lecture is called A Spark of King David. Let me just in 5 minutes explain to you where that expression comes. We are talking about 4th century long tale of rumors and gossip. Yes, Rabbi Israel Najara was also the victim, if you want, of what today we call shaming in the internet. Rabbi Israel Najara was equated to a spark of King David, following a tradition in which King David himself is depicted as Orpheus, as a man whose power to make music is his main asset. So here you have, by the way, this beautiful mosaic from Gaza, from the synagogue in Gaza. You see, Gaza returns to us in this lecture more than once. So what happened to Rabbi Israel? Rabbi Israel lived in Damascus. One of his neighbors was Rabbi Chaim Vital. Rabbi Chaim Vital is the main inheritor of legacy of Rabbi Yitzhak Luri Ashkenazi, the Ari Kadosh, the father of the Sephardian Kabbalah. And this sharing of a space created the tensions that were based mostly on behavior patterns, on other more human sentiments like jealousy, in my humble opinion. So Rabbi Chaim Vital, in his memories, in his diary, wrote very nasty stories about Rabbi Israel Najara. I won't go, I don't have the time to go into the details, but these stories of this shaming of Rabbi Israel Najara persecuted him throughout his life, even until the present. And this is an amazing story of gossip within the rabbinical world. Now, what happened was something very simple. To add to the shaming of Rabbi Chaim Vital, the grandson of Rabbi Israel Najara became one of the most important figures in the Sabbathian movement. So the Najara family was also linked to the false Messiah, to Sabbatai Shvi, and that didn't add to Rabbi Israel Najara. And still, within the people, his poetry and his figure was admired. So what you needed was a process of historical sanitation to clear up his name. And therefore, already in the late 17th century, early 18th century, even in a place like Frankfurt, we already have a text that says, our holy Rabbi the Ari, Rabbi Yitzhak Luri Ashkenazi, who was the rabbi of the aforementioned Rabbi Israel, testified that he was a spark of King David. One can be more sanitizing than the very figure of the Ari of Yitzhak Luri Ashkenazi saying about Rabbi Israel that he was a spark of King David. Of course, the Ari could not have been the rabbi of Najara simply because the Ari died when Najara was a very young man, perhaps 16, 17 years old. It's very inconceivable that he was a student of him. However, they add in this sanitation process other themes. In the book Shevet Muzar that was published in Turkey about the same decade, the first decade of the 18th century, they say that Najara composed or performed songs inspired by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit himself, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is the source of Najara's inspiration. Here you have another book published a little bit later, Sefer Chemdat Yamim, in which once again the entire story of Najara as the spark of King David is being reproduced. So you see that also the process of sanitation goes on from generation on generation. And here Rabbi Chaim David Azulai, the Chida, in his Shema Gdolim, he also writes and he says that the Hari himself says that the songs by Najara are important in heaven. Not only that he was a student of him, but the Hari himself said that the songs by Najara can influence heaven, can influence the Kadosh Baruch Hu himself. no less. And here, Rabbi Chaim David Azulai also mentions that the second part of his poems remain in manuscript. I already mentioned Sherit Israel. Now look at this. This is a blog from 2011. And the blog has an article called Rabbi Israel Najara Pervert, 2011. And this is a story related to the founder of modern Ashkenazi Orthodoxy, Rabbi Moses Sofer, the Chassam Sofer, who told his son the following story. The author of the Zemer, Rabbi Israel Najara, served as the Chazan of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. So now he's even the Chazan of the great Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. Look how the legends go and grow throughout the ages. The morning after Najara composed Kol Ribon Olam, Yah Ribbon Olam, the Arizal told him that yesterday night, while he was composing the wonderful Zemer, the Shekhinah, together with the Pamalia Shel Mala, the host of angels, came to visit him. But when they arrived, they saw that he was sitting at his Shabbos table, lo and behold, without wearing a jacket. What a sin! That was presumably disgraceful because the story goes that at the sight of a jacketless Najara, the Shekhinah and the Pamalia, all the angels, turned around and left. Later, the Ksav Sofer, the son of the Chassam Sofer, hypothesized that this was actually the reason why the Chassam Sofer never really wanted to recite the Zemer Yah Ribbon Olam. Look at this, Ashkenazi Jewry in the 19th century. The internet in the 21st century still discussing whether Najara was wearing a jacket or was not wearing a jacket. Eventually, among Hasidic circles in Israel, Najara became a Mekubal, the Kabbalist Talmid Ha'ari. And there are stories about him being said.
קודש
Look at this.
קודשים היה. הכל לפניו גלוי. היה לו שכן, קוראים לו בישראל נג'רה, עליו השלום.
Since you don't understand Hebrew, I don't want to spend more time in that story, but this is an oral version of all the same story that I read to you with many more details that are said by this rabbi to his audience to justify Rabbi Israel Najara's standing. We have 5 minutes to the end, so let me go fast about the rediscovery of Rabbi Israel Najara in the modern period, as much as the time will allow. We see that in 1836, the Jewish community in Belgrade reprinted the poetry by Najara. And in the introduction to their book, what they say is very simple. We only have one copy left of the rabbi's poetry, and the book is disintegrating, falling apart. Therefore, we made a fundraising, and we are now reprinting the whole book again in 1836. Once again, showing the extreme demand for this poetry, and the poetry, remember, is performed musically all the time. It's not just for the book to be printed, but the book to be used by the singers. Of course, a book published in Belgrade in 1836 found its way into the Maskilic, into the illuminated or enlightened circles of modern Jews in Europe. Some of his poetry of Najara is printed in Vienna in 1856 on the basis of a manuscript that was purchased by the Jewish community in Vienna from Livorno. So you see how the songs are transmitted through Italy into the Habsburg Empire, into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You see reports in the Jewish press about a new manuscript located at the Jewish community of Amsterdam, in the library of the Ashkenazi Jewish community, this manuscript. You see the great Landhaus Amudei Avodah the towerings of the liturgy, of the Jewish liturgy, referring to Najara. And this is how this great poet signed his name. An entire chapter on Najara dedicated in this Maskil book. You see that Najara's homilies that remain in manuscript were never printed, get their first printed edition in Ashkenaz, in Pressburg in 1890. And there is an entire chapter about the history of Rabbi Israel Najara based on the sources that I already mentioned before. In London, this is in your honor again. I was trying to bring issues that are related to the British Empire, to Great Britain, to the city of London. Here, the Reverend Francis L. Cohen, a very important figure in Jewish music in England and later in Australia, published the Tikkun Tal, the Tal prayer as set in a poem by Rabbi Israel Najara. He writes that Rabbi Israel Najara died in 1581. I don't know from where he got this early date, but that's a big mistake. However, you see Najara's songs now arranged for four-part singing with a keyboard accompaniment, published in the Jewish magazine in 1889. Najara's poetry are also introduced to the Zemer Ivri, to the new Hebrew song in the land of Israel, the new settlement in Eretz Israel, the Zionist settlement also adapts some of his songs. And here you see one of the earliest publications from 1897. I will jump a little bit into the most important documenter of Najara's musical poetry, and this is the great Jewish musicologist Avraham Tzvi Edelson, who moved to Jerusalem in 1907, and he found in Jerusalem the established Jewish communities of Judeo-Spanish-speaking and Arabic-speaking Jews, and all of them sing Najara. He became extremely interested in the poet and the poetry, and he published many musical transcriptions of his poems in different versions, and also this very, very important article on Rabbi Israel Najara and his poetry. Najara's poetry continued to be performed to this very day in Turkey too. You see here one of the most important centers for the performance of Najara's poetry, the synagogue Ka'al Kadosh Gadol, the main synagogue of the city of Edirne in the European part of Turkey. And this is how the synagogue looks today. It was reconstructed recently by the Turkish government. This synagogue, the group of singers that used to sing Najara's poetry in the 19th century, attribute the learning of the music to Rabbi Israel Najara himself, who appeared in the dreams to the beadle of the synagogue, to the secretary of the synagogue, and taught him all the melodies so that the Jews can perform them. And here you see the songs of this tradition, Turkish tradition, the songs of Najara, published in 2009 in Istanbul. I think that I will stop here. If you want me, I can add more, but I want to keep to our timing just to tell you that Rabbi Israel Najara is very much well and alive in Israel, and every important city in Israel has a street named Najara. Jerusalem, Rehovot, Ranana, Safed, etc. I could tell you many more stories, but I will stop here to take your questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Seroussi, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm actually disappointed there are no streets named Rehov Seroussi in Israel. Maybe you can correct me. Let me hand over to Alison, who will take us through the Q&A.
Hi, thank you very much. So I have a couple of questions. The first one, was any of Najara's work commissioned by famous or important people of the time, or did he just create everything for himself out of his own imagination? and
Yeah.
out of a willingness just to produce this wonderful poetry. He just did it for himself and for the people, or he was asked with commissions.
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting question. It's a very modern question. We are used today to works of art being commissioned. As far as I know, the answer is no. He wrote out of his own inspiration, out of his own energy to create poetry for his community. However, Rabbi Israel wrote also on commission, he wrote letters. People asked him to write letters, and he even wrote contracts, so this is not poetry, but other type of literature. He also wrote a few poems, not as many as the sacred poems, but a few, let's call them secular poems, dedicated to different figures, rabbinical figures in Safed and in Damascus. And this secular poetry was also printed as an appendix to the book Zemirot Israel of Venice in 1600. And this exchange of poetry, which is very common to Sephardic poets, even going back to the medieval period, also in the Arab world, it was very common to poets to exchange poems. It's not a poem on commission, but when he got a poem by someone, he wrote him back. So here you can perhaps take that exchange of epistolaries, of poetical epistolaries, as a sort of commission in a way.
Thank you. You mentioned Safed, so we have a question. Do you know whether or not the Sufis who lived in Safed at the time used similar melodies?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, which I hope to answer in an article that should appear very soon, and it's called Judeo-Sufi Musical Intersections. Certainly, there was a close encounter between Jewish mysticism and Muslim mysticism in different parts of the Ottoman Empire. And there was a Sufi monastery next to Safed that is very well known. To what degree the music was shared, it's a question. However, one of the melodies that Rabbi Israel Najara mentioned, a Turkish melody, is by one of the most important Sufi poets. So at least he knew one song, that is to say the text and the music, of Pir Abdal Sultan, a very important Sufi that became a song that was very well known at the time. And the Rabbi Israel Najara wrote on the basis of that melody, that Sufi melody, a poem in Hebrew. So the answer is yes, there were certainly interactions. We don't know to what extent these interactions were intense. We don't know about their intensity, but there was a connection, there was.
Okay, and we have another question. We have someone asking about Najara's choice of song settings according to Arabic and Turkish makamat. Did he have clear modal preferences?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Yes, I think, first of all, let me put this. I didn't want to go into details regarding Turkish Jewish modality because that's too much of a theoretical musicological issue, but I see that we have in the audience people who know. So let me tell you this. The arrangements of the makamat are more or less according to the arrangements of the Turkish usage of the time, and that is in respect to the order of the makamat. Now, there are makamat that have, or if I use the Turkish term makamlar, that have many more songs than others. So there are certain basic makams that there were many more melodies available, and there were used by many more composers than other modes that are more rare. So in that sense, yes, there is a preference for more usual modes. What is even more interesting, think about this. Many of the melodies he uses are Judeo-Spanish melodies. These are melodies coming from Spain. They were not conceived or composed according to the principles of the Turkish or Arabic modes. So the rabbi had, in a way, to classify by analyzing the melodies to what makam they will fit. And in this sense, it's interesting that all the Spanish melodies, the vast majority of them, appear in 2 or 3 makams that, not surprisingly enough, are close to the major and minor musical scales of Western music. So here you have a very interesting musicological procedure that Najara had to adapt melodies coming from another culture, from European culture, into the system of Turkish music.
Thank you. So leading on from that, what would you say was his native language? Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, or something else?
Yeah, that's very clear. The language of the family, the language in which he was born, was Judeo-Spanish. If you want to call it Ladino, you can call. Some people argue against the use of the word Ladino, but that is the language of the family, Alison. If Judeo-Spanish continued to be spoken until the 21st century, certainly in the generation, 2 generations after the expulsion from Spain, people spoke Spanish. Arabic was the language of the area, of the cultural area. Certainly, the rabbi knew Arabic because that was the language of communication with the entire surrounding society. Hebrew, of course, and Aramaic is the language, the basic language of a Jewish scholar, and therefore he learned Hebrew also as a very, very young child, perhaps even from the age of 3 or 4, when formal education was started, certainly in rabbinical families. He also, now the question is how much Turkish he knew. And this is a question that scholars have separated: to what extent Ottoman Jews, what was the extent of the knowledge of Turkish? That was the language of the empire, the language of the bureaucracy, the language of the government, but not the language of the majority of the population who spoke Arabic. That's a question that I am not sure how to answer, but certainly he knew enough Turkish to be able to listen to a Turkish song and quote it, the first line of the Turkish song in his book, with Hebrew characters. I forgot to say that all the melodic indications, whether they are in Arabic, Turkish, Spanish, or Greek, they're all in Hebrew characters. So some Turkish, of course, he knew. How much he knew, we don't know.
Okay, I have 2 more questions, and then I think we'll close the evening. So my first question, did Rabbeinu Avraham ben Ramban credibly declare that Sufi music recreates those of the temple era Levites?
Well, that's what Rabbi Abraham said, and I won't argue with him.
Okay, that's an easy one. And I have my last question is, did Najara write for voice only, or did he intend to have instrumental parts? And if so, what were the traditional instruments of that time?
Yeah, well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. We assume that there was instrumental music, of course, among the Jewish communities in that part of the world. If there is, if the rabbi played an instrument or not, I venture to say that he did, but I have no tangible evidence except for his poetry, where sometimes he uses a language that you can interpret that as paraphrasing the Psalms, but sometimes it sounds like he's saying, I took the nevel, I took the instrument to play. And when he says nevel, it means in the Hebrew of that time, in terms of musical instruments, nevel is the oud, the instrument, the major instrument, the main instrument of Arabic music from the medieval period and into our days is the oud. I would assume that if Rabbi Israel played an instrument, he will play the oud, and this was the main instrument to accompany singers at the time. Of course, there were other instruments, certainly the ney, the flute that is so characteristic of Sufi music, most probably could be or probably some Jews knew how to play that instrument too. But remember that most of the poetry that he wrote, that Rabbi Israel wrote, was for Jewish holidays and for Jewish occasions where musical instruments are not allowed. And therefore, I would say that the majority of the piece of the music was performed a cappella by soloists and by the congregation.
Thank you very much for all your wonderful questions. And I'm going to hand over to Sarah Benazet from the Institute of Jewish Studies to close the evening. Sarah.
Yes, I wanted to say thank you, Alison. So on behalf of our director, Mark Geller, who unfortunately can't be here, gives his apologies, and myself, I just wanted to add my thanks for it's a really fascinating lecture. And I also wanted to say how much we value this collaboration with the BFHU. Also, the IJS does have a lecture. We've got an event in 2 weeks' time on a very different subject that's about Assyria and the Hebrew Bible. So if anybody wants to know about that, please do email us. It's in the chat, ijs@ucl.ac.uk. So thank you very much, everybody. And thanks to the audience. You've been terrific and great questions. And thank you also, Edwin. Fantastic lecture.